On the exact 5-year anniversary of my husband's death, my mother-in-law Margaret handed me a 30-day eviction notice right in front of my sobbing children. I didn't cry. I took action. I folded the paper, slipped it into my pocket, and politely offered her another slice of cake. 72 hours later, the very foundation of her public identity completely collapsed, and she never saw it coming. For 5 years, I existed in a state of suspended animation. When you lose your husband at 40, the world expects you to shatter. They expect the dramatic collapse, the weeping in the grocery store aisles, the inability to get out of bed. But when you have a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old looking up at you to see if the sky is still falling, you don't get the luxury of shattering. You just go numb and you go to work. I was a head nurse. I spent my days managing chaotic emergency rooms, coordinating patient care, and swallowing my own exhaustion. I simply functioned. I paid the bills, I attended the parent-teacher conferences, and I kept the house smelling like lemon wood polish and fresh laundry, so the kids wouldn't feel the void David left behind. And then there was Margaret. Margaret was David's mother, and in her eyes, David was the sun, the moon, and the only functioning star in the galaxy. He was the golden child. And I was just the woman who had momentarily distracted him. For 15 years of marriage, Margaret made it a point to remind me that I was merely a placeholder. I wasn't from the right social background. My demanding career in nursing was charming, but decidedly working class. Everything I did was measured against an invisible standard of perfection that only Margaret possessed the answer key to. When David passed away, a normal mother-in-law would have leaned in to support the widowed woman raising her grieving grandchildren. Margaret leaned in to take control. She treated our home, the house David and I bought together, the one I was paying the monthly mortgage on, as her personal summer estate. She would drop by unannounced, run her finger over the wooden mantelpiece checking for dust, and casually rearrange my furniture while I was at the hospital working a 12-hour shift. She critiqued my cooking, my parenting methods, and even my grief. According to Margaret, I wasn't mourning correctly. I was moving on too fast or not fast enough. I was working too many hours, practically abandoning her precious grandchildren, yet simultaneously not providing them with the affluent lifestyle David would have naturally wanted. There was no winning. There was only enduring. But I had learned to endure. In my profession, you learn to absorb sudden panic and project steady calm. I treated Margaret like a difficult patient in emergency triage. Manage the symptoms, ignore the personal insults, keep the whole system stable. I kept my voice steady no matter what she threw at me. What Margaret didn't know, what literally nobody knew yet, was that my silent endurance at the hospital had actually paid off. 2 days before the 5th anniversary of David's passing, the board of directors called me into a highly private meeting. They were aggressively restructuring the entire private hospital network. They needed someone who actually understood the harsh clinical reality on the floor, not just the financial spreadsheets. They offered me the prestigious position of medical director for the entire regional chain. It was a massive, life-altering leap. It meant absolute executive authority, a corner office with a view, and a salary that would finally let me breathe easily. I had signed the finalized contract on a Friday afternoon. I planned to tell the kids after the Memorial Weekend was completely over. Margaret, ironically enough, spent a tremendous amount of time at my hospital network. Since David's untimely passing, she had taken up a volunteer position at the main campus's VIP concierge desk. To hear her proudly tell it at her expensive country club luncheons, she was practically running the hospital single-handedly. She wore that laminated volunteer badge like a heavy military medal of honor. It gave her exclusive access to elite doctors, wealthy board members, and the local high society. She loved absolutely nothing more than intercepting me in the busy public hallways right in front of my exhausted junior nurses to loudly ask if I was managing the stress of my little clinical shifts. It was her grand stage, her personal kingdom. I just let her have it. I let her have the snide, passive-aggressive comments, the highly unsolicited advice, the subtle daily digs at my professional competence. I kept the peace because I foolishly thought that was exactly what a good, resilient mother, a proper widow, was supposed to do for her family. But looking back now, From the other side of this nightmare, I realize exactly how dangerous that specific mindset truly is. We are constantly taught by society that keeping the peace is a selfless sacrifice. We swallow the blatant disrespect, bite our bleeding tongues, and repeatedly tell ourselves we are heroically protecting our fragile family from unnecessary conflict. But let me be perfectly clear about something. Keeping the peace with someone who fundamentally disrespects your humanity isn't diplomacy. It is simply a slow, quiet self-destruction given a polite name. You aren't avoiding a chaotic war, you are just volunteering to quietly take all the devastating casualties yourself. Every single time you force a smile through a cruel insult, every time you let a hard boundary be casually crossed just to avoid an explosive argument, you teach the narcissist that their abusive behavior is perfectly acceptable. You validate their delusion. And far worse, you silently teach your watchful children that enduring emotional abuse is just what familial love looks like. I wrongly thought I was firmly shielding my kids from Margaret's daily venom. I completely failed to realize I was merely setting the physical stage for her absolute masterpiece. That was the miserable setup I tolerated for 5 long years. Now here is the exact moment I stopped being patient and started being precise. It was a damp, gray Sunday afternoon. We were hosting the 5-year memorial gathering for David at my house. I had spent the entire exhausting morning cooking his absolute favorite meals, setting up a beautiful, dignified display of his photographs on the mantel, and making desperately my 2 young children felt comforted and safe. The living room was completely packed with David's extended relatives, Margaret's affluent country club friends, and a handful of quietly supportive neighbors. Margaret, predictably, held court right in the center of the crowded room. She was wearing an impeccably tailored black designer dress, dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with a ridiculous monogrammed lace handkerchief. She loved playing the tragic, fiercely grieving matriarch. At around 3 o'clock, she loudly tapped her heavy silver spoon against a crystal wine glass. The entire room quickly quieted down, turning to face her. She gave a lengthy, melodramatic, tearful speech about David's incredible legacy, completely omitting my name from his life story, which was entirely par for the course. My children, Emma and Leo, were sitting quietly on the sofa, holding hands tightly. Then Margaret's tone drastically shifted. The tragic widow act completely vanished, swiftly replaced by a cold, businesslike sharpness that I knew all too well. She turned directly to me, standing right in the center of the quiet living room, pulled a crisp white envelope from her expensive leather handbag, and practically shoved it toward my chest. "Sandra," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the utterly silent space so every single guest could hear her every syllable. "It has been 5 years. It is time for you to finally move on and find a place more suited to your current, modest lifestyle. This home rightfully belongs to the family estate. I expect you and the children out by the end of the month." My blood ran cold. I stared at the envelope in her perfectly manicured hand. I looked over at my young children, whose innocent eyes were suddenly wide with genuine, terrifying confusion. Leo, my youngest, started crying softly, burying his small face deep into his older sister's shoulder. Margaret hadn't just tried to assert dominance. She had intentionally weaponized my children's raw grief to humiliate me in front of 50 people. The sheer audacity of the calculated move was breathtaking. I didn't scream. I didn't cause a pathetic scene. I calmly took the thick envelope, slipped it neatly into my cardigan pocket, and quietly asked if anyone needed more fresh coffee. I watched Margaret smile, a tiny, viciously triumphant smirk. She genuinely thought she had decisively won. But what I found hidden inside a dusty manila folder the very next morning changed everything I thought I knew about the past 5 years. At exactly 8 o'clock on Monday morning, I dropped the kids at their elementary school and drove straight to the downtown law firm that had handled David's complicated probate. I sat in a stifling, windowless waiting room with violently flickering fluorescent lights. The overwhelmed paralegal couldn't locate David's original file in the messy basement archives. I sat in that uncomfortable plastic chair for 40 agonizing minutes, aggressively staring at the ticking wall clock, my heart hammering violently in my chest, forcing myself to stay calm while the heavy anxiety threatened to completely choke me. Finally, the senior partner called me into his spacious office and placed the heavy, dust-covered files squarely on his polished oak desk. Margaret had always loudly claimed the house was securely tied up in an untouchable, generational family trust. She had repeatedly gaslit me into firmly believing I was essentially a vulnerable tenant in my own marital home, existing solely by her supposedly generous grace. I silently handed the experienced lawyer the cruel 30-day eviction notice. He adjusted his reading glasses, looked closely at the notice, and I watched him let out a short, humorless laugh. "Sandra," he said gently, physically turning his large computer monitor toward me, "Margaret has absolutely no legal authority to issue this document. When David sadly passed, the property deed was transferred entirely and legally into your name. There is absolutely no family trust holding this specific property. It is legally entirely and irrevocably yours. She has zero legal claim to it whatsoever." He handed me the official, Countess-stamped property deed. Seeing my own name printed clearly on the heavy, official watermarked paper was exactly like breathing pure oxygen after secretly drowning for 5 miserable years. This is the terrifying reality of complex, financial manipulation within toxic family systems. Financial abusers deliberately thrive in the murky shadows of unspoken assumptions and vague verbal agreements. They rely heavily on your emotional fatigue, desperately hoping you will be too utterly exhausted by your own grief to actually verify their bold, terrifying claims. But a legally binding document properly signed before a major conflict erupts is your most basic, fundamental form of absolute self-preservation. Financial abuse is still abuse, but unlike subtle emotional manipulation, it always leaves a concrete, highly undeniable paper trail. You just have to be willing to look for it. Always aggressively build your paper trail, and never, ever take legal advice from the exact person who actively benefits from your continued ignorance. I drove slowly home, tightly holding that precious deed. The suffocating fear was completely gone, rapidly replaced by a cold, calculating, mathematical clarity. For 5 agonizing years, I had weakly allowed Margaret to dictate the false narrative. I had let her play the grand benefactor while I played the grateful, wildly inadequate widow. I looked down at the ridiculous eviction notice sitting harmlessly on my passenger seat. And then, my cell phone buzzed loudly in my purse. It was an urgent email from Human Resources, firmly confirming the final onboarding schedule for my brand new executive role. I had a very different eviction planned. The paper trail was finally secured, so here is where I stopped surviving and started executing. It was a bustling Thursday afternoon at the main hospital campus. I walked straight down the long, brightly lit corridor toward the prestigious VIP concierge desk. Margaret was holding court, surrounded by 3 wealthy donors and a senior cardiologist. I stopped behind a large pillar for just a second. My chest tightened painfully. I thought I was ready for that moment. I wasn't, not entirely. My hand shook so badly I almost dropped the heavy folders. That is the raw, ugly reality of confronting an abuser. Your body remembers the fear even when your mind is finally resolute. I forced myself to take 3 slow, grounding breaths, smoothed my uniform, and stepped out into the open lobby. Margaret spotted me immediately. She leaned over the pristine marble counter, ensuring everyone around her was paying attention. "Sandra, darling, shouldn't you be at home right now, ensuring you actually get all those boxes packed?" she asked, her voice dripping with artificial, syrupy concern. She playfully tapped her laminated volunteer badge, looking around for validation from the doctors. "I just want to make sure I don't have to hire a cleaning crew after you finally vacate the property next week." I didn't flinch. I walked directly up to the high desk, completely ignoring the curious onlookers. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping all emotion from my tone. I placed 2 heavily sealed manila envelopes directly onto her neat desk calendar. I slid the first one open, revealing the freshly stamped, undeniable property deed with my sole name glowing in stark black ink. Next to it, I placed the official, legally binding hospital termination notice, explicitly barring her from the premises, signed boldly by the newly appointed regional medical dyer. See Tor. Me. Margaret aggressively snatched up the deed first. Her confident, theatrical posture instantly evaporated. She stared at the thick legal paper, her eyes violently darting back and forth across my printed name, completely unable to process the absolute failure of her long con. Then she slowly picked up the second document, her eyes dropping down to the bold executive's signature at the bottom. She didn't scream or throw a dramatic tantrum. She just sat there, frozen and small, as the reality of her total defeat crushed her, her face entirely drained of color. The surrounding doctors and nurses had stopped mid-sentence, sensing the sudden shift in gravity. The busy lobby room went dead silent. "Your volunteer services are no longer required at my hospital," I stated flatly. Watching her crumple into that chair, I finally understood something vital. People often confuse setting boundaries with being vindictive, but a boundary is merely a description of what you will and will not tolerate. Enforcing them is not cruelty, it is just clarity. You cannot ever reason with someone who actively benefits from misunderstanding you. When you finally stand up for yourself, they will inevitably accuse you of running a vicious smear campaign. But telling the objective truth with legal documents is not a smear campaign. Protecting your peace by leaving the toxic situation quietly, legally, and permanently is the single most powerful thing you can do. After I spoke those final, devastating words, I didn't wait for her to formulate a pathetic response. I simply turned around and walked away, the sharp clicks of my practical nursing shoes echoing loudly in the silent, cavernous lobby. I felt an incredible, soaring weightlessness in my chest. For the very first time in 15 long years, I wasn't carrying the crushing burden of Margaret's impossible expectations. I wasn't the incredibly inadequate daughter-in-law or the disappointing, tired widow. I was the absolute master of my own reality. I walked straight into the private executive elevator, pressed the heavy button for the top floor, and watched the metal doors smoothly close on the most toxic chapter of my entire adult life. But the long day was far from over. I knew Margaret would not simply accept this total, humiliating defeat without attempting to forcefully salvage her shattered narrative. She desperately needed an audience to maintain her fragile delusion. I had successfully stripped her of her public kingdom at the busy hospital, but I still had to formally reclaim my private sanctuary at home. I left work exactly at 5 o'clock. I drove slowly through the thick evening traffic, my mind functioning with a cold, terrifying efficiency. I vividly realized that for the last 5 agonizing years, I had essentially lived like a temporary ghost in my own beautiful house. Emotionally, I packed my bags every single time she walked through the front door, always subconsciously waiting for the inevitable day she would finally try to brutally throw me out onto the cold street. That insidious fear completely ends today. I pulled directly into the driveway. Her expensive luxury sedan was already parked aggressively across the center line, selfishly taking up 2 spaces. She had obviously rushed straight to the house after the devastating lobby incident. I quickly unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped into the warm, familiar foyer. The house was completely quiet. My wonderful babysitter had already safely taken the kids out to the local park for the evening, exactly as I had strictly instructed her to do. I fundamentally needed this final, decisive space to be entirely empty of innocent eyes. I slowly walked into the main living room. Margaret was sitting stiffly on my expensive velvet sofa, clutching her leather handbag with absolute white-knuckled intensity. The absolute arrogance was completely gone, rapidly replaced by a desperate, cornered panic. She looked up at me, her eyes red and puffy, clearly trying to quickly calculate her next manipulative angle. She desperately wanted to start a massive screaming match, to easily bait me into losing my temper so she could immediately play the terrified victim. I refused to give her the satisfying fuel. I simply walked over to the large bay window, opened the heavy curtains to let the fading sunlight pour into the room, and turned back to face her. The silence stretched out, thick and deeply suffocating, deliberately designed to make her as uncomfortable as humanly possible. I just watched her squirm. What she aggressively said next was the ultimate proof of her absolute, terrifying delusion. She glared at me, her knuckles white, and delivered the single most infuriating quote of her entire miserable life. "David only married you to upset me," she spat, her voice trembling with vicious malice. "You were never supposed to actually keep his house. You were just a temporary phase he outgrew before he died, and taking my hospital position is nothing but pathetic, lower-class revenge." I didn't blink. I didn't let her see even a microscopic fracture in my armor. I simply looked down at her and delivered my response with absolute, chilling certainty. He left everything to me because he knew exactly who you were, Margaret. And now, the entire hospital knows it too. She didn't scream. She slowly stood up, her entire body shaking violently, and walked out the front door without another word. I watched her car back out of the driveway, the tires screeching slightly on the pavement. Walking out of that living room felt like a definitive victory. But the next 72 hours taught me exactly what that kind of victory actually costs, because a cornered narcissist, stripped of their narrative control, is the most dangerous version of themselves. They didn't collapse quietly. They collapsed loudly, messily, and in a way that exposed exactly who they had always been to the entire world. By Tuesday morning, Margaret had initiated a scorched earth smear campaign that would have impressed a military dictator. She spent hours systematically calling every single extended family member, every wealthy country club associate, and every mutual friend we shared in the local community. Her frantic story was a masterpiece of twisted, manipulative fiction. She tearfully claimed that I had brutally forged David's signature on a fake property deed, secretly stolen her beloved hospital job out of pure, unadulterated spite, and was attempting to completely legally sever her from her beloved grandchildren. My phone started vibrating relentlessly with confused, angry texts from cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. The voicemails were filled with harsh judgments and demanding questions. In the past, that sudden, overwhelming wave of collective disapproval would have completely broken me. I would have frantically drafted long, defensive text messages, desperately begging them to understand my side of the complicated story. But standing in my kitchen, listening to those angry voicemails, I finally grasped the profound, life-altering difference between two very specific emotions that toxic people use to control you. There is a massive, fundamental distinction between guilt and shame, and understanding this difference is the absolute key to setting yourself free. Guilt is an internal compass that softly tells you that you did something morally wrong. It is a healthy mechanism for course correction. But shame is an external, deeply toxic poison poured into you by an abuser, designed to make you feel like you fundamentally are wrong, flawed, and unworthy of basic respect. For 15 years, Margaret had deliberately weaponized shame against me, strategically conditioning me to believe that advocating for my own peace was an act of unforgivable selfishness. She used my natural empathy against me, knowing I would always absorb the blame to spare the family from awkward tension. Narcissistic systems rely heavily on this exact dynamic. They need you to internalize the shame, so they never have to take accountability for their own cruel actions. Do not ever let them convince you that protecting your children from their toxic chaos is a shameful act. It is not. It is the most vital, heroic thing you will ever do in your entire life. Instead of defending myself to her flying monkeys, I took a very different, much colder approach. I completely ignored the chaotic noise. I didn't answer a single text message or return a single frantic phone call. I simply took out my laptop, scanned the official property deed and the signed letter from the law firm explicitly confirming its total, undeniable validity, and sent a single, mass email to the entire extended family. I didn't include a long, emotional explanation or a desperate plea for their understanding. I just attached the cold, hard, legal evidence. The subject line simply read, "For your records regarding David's estate." The silence that followed was incredibly deafening. Within 3 short hours, the angry text messages completely stopped. The frantic voicemails ceased. The people who had been violently demanding my immediate apology were suddenly confronted with the undeniable, stamped proof of Margaret's absolute, pathological lies. Several of them tried to awkwardly backpedal, sending sheepish messages claiming they had just been concerned and hadn't wanted to take sides. I simply deleted those messages without replying. You do not owe your precious energy to people who only require the truth when it comes neatly packaged in a legal document. But Margaret was not finished. Having completely lost the hospital, the house, and now the unwavering blind loyalty of her extended family, she resorted to the absolute lowest, most desperate tactic imaginable. Late on Thursday night, just as the kids were finally going to sleep, I heard a loud, violent pounding on my heavy oak front door. The knocks were frantic, aggressive, and relentless. I quickly checked the digital security camera on my phone. The live feed buffered slightly, the screen freezing for 2 agonizing seconds before finally clearing up. The imperfect technology only heightened my rapidly spiking adrenaline. When the pixelated image finally stabilized, I saw Margaret standing aggressively on my front porch in the freezing, torrential, unforgiving rain, her expensive designer coat soaked through to the bone, holding a large, heavy, rusted metallic object tightly in her right hand. She wasn't just there to pointlessly yell or casually intimidate me through the thick glass anymore. She was there to forcefully break back into the quiet, peaceful, and fiercely protected life she arrogantly believed she still rightfully owned. And what she deliberately did with that heavy steel object next proved exactly why I had to make the absolute hardest, most devastating, and completely irreversible phone call of my entire adult life. Margaret raised the heavy steel tire iron and violently smashed it directly into the vintage glass panel of my front door. The shattering sound was absolutely deafening, echoing like a sudden gunshot through the quiet, suburban neighborhood. I didn't scream, and I didn't run towards the dangerous chaos. I immediately backed away into the dark hallway, pulled my cell phone from my pocket, and dialed emergency services. The dispatcher's voice was calm, but the reality of the situation was terrifyingly slow. The police didn't magically arrive in 2 cinematic minutes. It took 22 agonizing minutes for a single patrol car to finally pull into the long driveway. During those excruciating 22 minutes, Margaret continued to scream David's name, violently threshing against the heavy reinforced oak frame, desperately demanding that I let her inside her rightful home. She was completely unhinged, finally stripped of her elegant country club facade, revealing the deeply disturbed, entitled woman underneath. When the 2 young officers finally approached the porch, the driving rain was still pouring relentlessly. They had to physically restrain her as she aggressively swung the rusted tire iron in their direction. Watching them securely place Margaret in the back of the flashing cruiser, I felt a strange, profound sense of absolute emptiness. There was no triumphant joy, no sudden burst of euphoric vindication. There was only the exhausted, quiet relief of a long, devastating war finally reaching its absolute end. The very next morning, I stood before a county judge and successfully secured a permanent, comprehensive restraining order. It legally barred Margaret from coming within 500 feet of myself, my 2 children, my private residence, and the entire hospital campus. I changed all the locks, upgraded the digital security system, and permanently blocked every single phone number associated with her or her remaining loyalists. The complete, absolute silence that followed was initially terrifying. For 15 years, my entire nervous system had been aggressively wired to constantly anticipate her next unpredictable attack. When you have been trapped inside a toxic family dynamic for that long, the sudden absence of their chaotic abuse actually feels like a threatening void. This is the insidious, deeply misunderstood reality of trauma bonding. We often wonder why incredibly smart, capable people stay stubbornly loyal to the exact family members who actively destroy their mental health. It is because the abuser deliberately creates a devastating cycle of intense punishment followed by breadcrumbs of basic, minimal decency. They starve you of genuine respect, so when they finally offer a single, polite conversation, your desperate brain registers it as profound love. You become chemically addicted to the exhausting roller coaster, constantly trying to perfectly manage their volatile moods just to experience a brief, fleeting moment of superficial peace. You mistakenly believe that your unwavering loyalty will eventually cure their deep, fundamental brokenness. But you cannot ever heal a narcissist with your unconditional love. They will simply consume your empathy until you are entirely hollow, and then they will violently blame you for suddenly being so empty. Breaking a severe trauma bond requires you to mourn not just the abusive person, but the persistent, delusional fantasy that they would one day miraculously change. It requires you to brutally accept that the mother-in-law you desperately wanted never actually existed, and the dangerous woman standing on your porch is the only absolute truth. I had to look at my 2 beautiful children and actively choose to radically break the generational curse. Going completely no contact with a toxic family member is never a dramatic, Impulsive punishment meant to teach them a lesson. It is a necessary, calculated medical decision to protect your own psychological survival. You do not negotiate with a virulent disease, you simply eradicate your exposure to it. I chose absolute, unapologetic clarity over maintaining a dangerous, comforting illusion. In the months that followed that terrifying night, my life slowly transformed into something beautifully unrecognizable. I formally stepped into my new role as regional medical director. The hospital flourished under my clinical leadership, and I was finally able to implement the compassionate, practical policies I had always fiercely advocated for as a tired, overworked head nurse. The house, which had previously felt like a heavily contested war zone, finally became a genuine, warm home. We painted the walls bright, cheerful colors, replaced Margaret's stiff, formal antique furniture with comfortable, welcoming pieces, and filled the quiet rooms with music and genuine laughter. My children began to visibly thrive, completely free from the heavy, suffocating pressure of Margaret's impossible, critical standards. They finally learned that true, healthy family love does not require you to constantly earn your basic right to exist. I still think about David every single day, but the profound grief is no longer toxically intertwined with the crushing anxiety of his mother's overbearing presence. I can finally honor his memory on my own exact terms. When I look back at that scared, exhausted widow I used to be 5 years ago, the woman who silently swallowed every cruel insult just to keep the fragile peace, I want to gently each back through time and tell her that she is so much stronger than she realizes. We are continuously conditioned to wrongly believe that walking away from abusive family members is the ultimate failure, a shameful inability to just make things work. Leaving quietly, legally, and permanently is the single most powerful thing you can ever do. You do not owe anyone your precious sanity just because they happen to share a last name with someone you loved. Your only fundamental responsibility is to protect your peace and safeguard the innocent children who rely entirely on your strength. People who scream the absolute loudest about family loyalty have almost always done the absolute least to actually earn it. I survived the fire. Then I built a beautiful, unshakable empire. I finally won. So what do you think? Did I go too far or not far enough? Let me know in the comments below.